it's been a very isolated year, so.
Certainly has. Yeah.
Did I see that Oneonta, New York, supplied the Christmas tree to Rockefeller Center this year?
Last year.
No.
Again this year. Wow, that's
That's
Wow,
what I
very
saw
good.
this morning. There was a
Grow
little
'em.
owl stuck in it.
Growing big.
Yep, a tiny saw wet owl that is doing fine now, actually. But they put it up in Saugerties, so you might want to get your owl back.
Okay. We also had the largest single campus outbreak of COVID in the U.S. at SUNY Oneonta at the state school. It's a party school. It's often referred to as Stoniana. They had 800 cases in a week.
Hey, there's no such thing as bad publicity, right?
Yeah, that's right. And enrollment went up after that.
Yeah, they only have 700 students.
Yeah, they have about 5,000 students. It was a good dose. Yeah, parties before the first week of school. So yeah, Oneonta's on the map for several reasons.
Well,
Mostly our lab, of course. That's right.
Of course, yeah. Well, on that extremely interesting note, welcome everyone to the ultimate, and by ultimate, I mean final in this series session of Small Grains for Brewing and Distilling happy hours, virtual happy hours. It's great to see everyone here, and today we're going to talk about spring barley. So we've got a great video featuring me that we're going to look at with some virtual crop walks, and it's across all of our ESPN sites. So it's pretty cool because of the barley, not necessarily because of me. And then we're going to hear from James, who's going to give us some perspective on that and data included. So good stuff. Nice box and whisker plots. I'm always excited about that, and I know you are too, Aaron. And we also have Alison Babb from Empire Malts up in Empire. And he's not quite here yet, but I believe Gary West will be joining us too from West Acres in Croswell, Michigan, who has had great success growing spring barley varieties that have proven difficult in other areas of Michigan. So without further belaborment and ado, I will hand it over to James.
Hey everybody. Cheers for happy hour.
Cheers.
As Ryan said, we had the unique opportunity this year of collecting some footage, and it was really in lieu of the field days that we normally offer to get people out into the field, actually looking at the crop. So sort of disappointed that we couldn't do what we normally do, but it forced us to get outside the box and think about our outreach work a little bit differently. So we shot footage highlighting some of the varieties that have really had a track record here the last few years in Michigan, and looking a little bit to the future as well. And what's different and neat is that we can basically have this field day experience watching the video together, and then also look at the yield data. So you can directly connect what you experience in the video with the numbers that you see in the tables and the figures. And that probably is advantageous and something that's a little bit new that COVID has allowed us or forced us to do. So we'll start by watching the video, and I'm going to try to play it off a media space here. Oh, Ryan, I think you have to make me a co-host if you right click on my name. I can share screen. If the quality's bad this way, I'll just put a link in the chat and everybody can watch it on your own machine through your browser, but we'll see if sharing the screen works. Okay. Okay. You seeing my screen?
Yep. I can.
Yes.
Yep. You have to do the computer audio checkbox, James.
Computer audio checkbox?
Under share, when you do click on share.
Okay, let me stop share.
There's a checkbox on that up. I think it's on the up arrow.
Share screen. Yeah, sorry, I'm not seeing that. Where is the audio setting?
Oh. We're not hearing, I don't know, did anybody else hear any audio? No,
No audio.
it's
Advanced sharing options. Let me see.
yeah. But
Well,
I think
here's
you have to click out, you have to share screen first, and then I think click that to get that to come up. It's been a while since I've done it. I can't remember
I
now.
see it. I see it now at the bottom. Okay. Optimize screen sharing for video clip. Sure. Share. Okay, let's try this again.
Yeah.
It's July 31st, 2020. I'm Ryan Hamilton here in Posen, Michigan. I'm here at WK Kellogg Biological Station. I'm here at Michigan State University Upper Peninsula Research and Extension Center at the Eastern Spring Barley Nursery Variety Trial Plots, or ESBN for short. The ESBN is a really important study for our region and many non-traditional barley producing regions throughout the Northeast and Midwest. It's administered by North Dakota State University with funding from the American Malting Barley Association and the Brewers Association in conjunction with Bell's Brewery and the Michigan Brewers Guild. The study is very important because it looks at experimental barley varieties and commercially released malting barley varieties and how they might perform in our region and what may be good candidates given our specific factors like tendency to pre-harvest sprout, fungal diseases like fusarium that produce DON or deoxynivalenol. There's 3 different sites throughout Michigan, the southernmost being at Kellogg Biological Station, this being kind of in the middle, and I'm right up here by the tip of the index finger in Presque County, and the other being at Chatham, Michigan by Munising in the Upper Peninsula. So this gives us a good idea throughout the 3 different sites in Michigan of what might be a great candidate for a particular farmer in a particular region to see success with malting barley. There are 25 malting barley varieties in the ESBN across 13 locations, mainly public universities and institutions. And I would like to take a look at a handful of them that I think are very important for our region. This is Pinnacle, which was bred at North Dakota State University, and our variety trial plots that were going to contain Pinnacle weren't very successful, but what we have here are some Pinnacle that did survive and come through. And it looks to me characteristically like Pinnacle should. The kernels are plump, very, very plump, like little footballs. And it's beautiful, and that's about all I can really say that's good about these. Characteristic of Pinnacle as well is its blue tinted stem with tons and tons of evidence of foliar disease. A lot of these heads that you see here are showing signs of fusarium contamination, so it's going to be probably high down. Here's a perfect one right here. Look at those green kernels with one brown suspect there. This is a rather diseased looking plot. It has just rained out here and we're in between storm cells, so it will rain again this afternoon, and that is the time of serious sprout risk for these small grains at maturity. Pinnacle serves as sort of a local check variety for us here in Michigan. Conlin was the first 2-row malting barley to really gain supremacy, if you will, in Michigan as being widely cultivated. And Pinnacle sort of took its place due to lower beta-glucan values in malting, and we thought it would be a better candidate for Michigan. But it exhibits a lot of husk staining even through the malting process, so there were some customer complaints regarding that when I was back in the malt house, and its disease vulnerability kind of made it not such a great replacement for Conlin. So Conlin did have some advantages over it.
This is LCS Odyssey. It is a spring 2-row malting barley from Lima grain cereal seeds. And as you can see, it's rather short, but that's good protection against lodging. This has quickly become the most widely cultivated 2-row spring malting barley in our region, with good reason. It has good yields, excellent malting quality. As you can see, some of these awns are still green. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but there's definitely still some vivid green on these awns, so it's not quite mature yet. But depending on moisture levels, it might be okay to combine and then dry down below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Odyssey is a great variety for a number of reasons. It is a no GN producing variety, so for distilling, that means there's no presence of glycosidic nitriles, which can actually be transformed in the distilling process into ethyl carbamate, which is a carcinogen. It's a breeding target in European breeding programs to really push dual use barleys for brewing and distilling. So that makes Odyssey very attractive. It's also low in beta glucans, which is attractive for brewers, high extract, which is attractive to everyone. So Odyssey at this site had some trouble emerging from the boot at heading, and that set it back a little bit. And it also had, you might be able to see on camera, some trouble with blotch of some sort. Most likely spot blotch, but it could also be net blotch or both. Consequently, this stand is looking a little rough. The disease ratings were a 4 of 5. So it's right at the top of disease susceptibility and disease infection this year. Odyssey is the most widely cultivated 2-row malting barley in Michigan, not because of these factors, but it's good to see a broad range of performance across different sites, and it really illustrates the need for variety trials and research into variety performance at many different sites throughout Michigan. This is Explorer 2-row malting barley from Sacobra, a French plant breeding company. Last year at KBS, this was the second highest yielder in spring 2-rows next to Odyssey at 86 bushels per acre compared to Odyssey's 91. So an excellent yielder. But as you can see, it's kind of a thin stand this year. Weeds have taken in and really made their presence known here. Not a great stand necessarily. We've got some staining on the flag leaf, which is still retained on there. The kernels look plump, but not overly plump. They don't have that great fat football shape that we like, that we saw in Pinnacle. But it's shown some promise for sure as a commercially released variety, and one that's adapted to many, many regions, as its name Explorer would suggest. And I do think it's a good candidate of interest to keep our eyes on as an alternative to Odyssey or what we already have. But that's not necessarily evidenced in this plot right here. But we should wait and see what the analysis returns, and I still have hope for it. This is LCS Genie, which is also a spring 2-row malting barley from Lima grain. As you can see, we've got nice plump kernels. Not too much staining on them, but a bit more than the Odyssey. And in my experience in the past with growers and seeing samples come through the malt house, it had a higher propensity for kernel staining than Odyssey does, and some other varieties like Common, for instance. Last year here, it yielded about 68 bushels per acre, so well below the 91 bushels that we saw from LCS Odyssey. And it's hard to catch on camera here, but I'm seeing a couple heads that are affected by smut, which isn't a huge deal, but it's not something I noticed in Odyssey either. As far as germinative energy last year, or viability in the malt house, it was comparable to Odyssey as well. So it's not a bad choice if that's what you have to work with, but definitely I would recommend Odyssey over Genie. But this stand of Genie in particular this year looks really nice. A good second candidate if you can't get LCS Odyssey seed in the state. But the reason for me it would not be my first choice is, as you can see, this Genie is still in its bottle, so to speak. And by that I mean it's still green and it's not quite mature. It doesn't have that nice bright gold mature color like some of the other lines that we've talked about today. And I'm seeing some signs of foliar disease on the flag leaves and stems, and it has a bit to dry down before it's ready for harvest. The kernels in particular are looking a bit thin, so we don't see that plumpness that even we saw in the Pinnacle, which is so shabby looking. It still had mostly plump kernels, and these are thin. This particular head here looks like it could be mistaken for rye even, just based on kernel plumpness. But I wouldn't say this stand is necessarily indicative of its performance throughout the state at all sites, but it's something to be aware of, that Odyssey being our best choice for recommending for growing spring 2-row is for a good reason. And Genie has some promise, but that promise isn't necessarily going to be fulfilled everywhere throughout the state. So that's why these variety trials are so important, because you'll see differences in the way that varieties perform.
All right. Well, I hope that was a decent supplement to a normal field day, give you a sense of kind of what the plots looked like this year at the 3 different locations in Michigan, and specifically some of the varieties that we've been spending more time on for the last several years here in the state. I want to follow that up with a few slides. I won't spend a lot of time on the slides because Ryan covered a good deal of the information about the program, what the ESBN is, and the crowd that we've got here tonight is very much the in crowd. And so I think some discussion about what's going on with spring barley varieties probably be much more interesting than looking at these slides, but we can spend a few minutes on these too.
Thank you for including my terrible joke about Genie in a bottle. And thank you for not using the Christina Aguilera song as a soundtrack.
Yeah, it was one of the highlights of the clips that we had, so I had to make sure to sneak it in there. So as Ryan said, you know, the ESBN's been going on since 2015. Unfortunately, this was the last year of the ESBN project. The Brewers Association has requested that this group of collaborators look at kind of what is the next step for understanding performance of spring barley varieties in sort of non-traditional growing environments here in the Midwest and the East Coast. During the years that it was active, there were 10 different universities and 13 locations, and each year there was around 25 different barley varieties that were tested in this program. It has included 2-rows and 6-rows, although more emphasis on 2-row in the recent years. And one of the highlights is that last year, the New Brewer published an article on this program, and that was nice to kind of get the word out about what has been learned so far and what the objectives are moving forward. So I can share these slides later, maybe even we can stick that in the chat later on and people can read that article if they're interested. These were the locations for the ESBN, and you can see the 3 green dots for Michigan. We're proud to say that we have 3 locations here in the state because of the diversity of growing environments that we have, particularly north to south for spring barley. Some pictures actually from last year, and this was a highlight because we got the AMBA board out to KBS. They had their board meeting in Michigan and got to tour the plots. And then the bottom right was our field day at Uprec last year. And I just thought that having some images of people together doing things was refreshing. So I kept those in there instead of showing you just pictures of plants from this year. Plus you saw the videos. This is the data that we collect, and you should be familiar with all of this. And the only thing I want to note here is that they only select a few locations for malting each year. And it's been great that Michigan locations have been on that list quite frequently. And actually, this last year for 2019, the 4 locations that were selected for malting are circled here, and 2 of those were Michigan locations. So we feel good about our ability to produce high quality and high yielding spring barley, particularly at our northern locations in the state here. And I think it's interesting to see that these locations that are on the same latitude with Fargo there, if you think about, NDSU running this program and Rich's material being in the study, it does make you wonder about kind of where some selections are being made on the variety list, and then how that influences where they perform best in the United States. But obviously that northern tier, we have some advantages. This is a little bit dated from Rich's 2018 analysis, but I want to use it to make the point that, obviously when we're looking at what varieties are appropriate for some of these new environments or a state like Michigan, no one variety is going to hit the mark on everything, like particularly agronomic priorities like yield versus things like malt extract or quality characteristics. So the approach that they've used is cluster analysis to group like varieties or group similar varieties based on multiple parameters across yield and quality. And that has really allowed us to narrow in on some of the varieties that have been most successful here in Michigan. And in that 2018 analysis, it was these clusters 3 and 4. And you can see here that, they're not necessarily the best in terms of something like yield. They're kind of middle of the road on yield, but they hit the mark consistently as a group on some of these other characteristics that are as, if not more important, as far as quality goes. So these couple of clusters include the varieties, some of the varieties that Ryan highlighted in the video, some of the varieties that have really gained traction here in Michigan, like Odyssey. And I think it's interesting with this project that we've really seen over several years of collecting this data that the information that we're collecting seems to be both driving some of the variety selection that's happening in the state, but also kind of confirming the experiential knowledge and the decisions that growers and maltsters are making in the state in terms of what varieties seem to be the best fit. So I really think, I do think that the ESPN has generated value for the state in that sense, and that we've actually seen some of this come to fruition as far as what varieties are actually being grown and processed in Michigan. So I've got a few data slides here for our locations this year, and I'll just mention a few things. It's a lot of numbers. Probably these tables are most useful for looking at the means, which are on the bottom right, but then also these are ordered by yield. So this is, 2020 yields here for Chatham that we're looking at first. And a couple of comments that I'll make about the Chatham location. Overall, yields were rather low this year, and I think quality is going to suffer as well. And the biggest issue that we had at Chatham this year was blotch. A lot of foliar disease symptoms this year, and I think it was mostly the fact that we had really consistent moisture this year. So I think we had a year that demonstrates why Michigan is a non-traditional or a minor barley region, because it really, 2 of our locations, Posen and Chatham, both suffered pretty seriously due to spot blotch in particular this year. You can see that in the foliar disease ratings. This is a 0 to 5, and you can see there is nothing below a 2 for disease, and we average a 3.5 out of 5. So really serious disease in this location. I And when you look at the varieties that yielded well, and this was the case also in Posen where we had disease pressure, it seems to be a lot of the North Dakota varieties, some of the numbered experimental varieties that did especially well this year. Something to look at, is not only maybe disease resistance characteristics that they're incorporating, but also the earliness factor. If you look at the heading dates here, it seemed that some of the varieties that were early in terms of heading and probably also then maturity, fared better this year, and maybe weren't as damaged by the blotch. And I think it might have been just a matter of filling out that grain, retaining that flag leaf just long enough to fill out that grain before the disease took over. Would be my impression, having walked out in the plots. The other thing that we have going on in Chatham, which we try to do a better job addressing this year, is bird damage. We have a lot of sandhill crane damage, especially late in the season. We had somebody do some shooting for us this year on some U.S. Fish and Wildlife permits, and that helped, but we still did have some damage. So that's another thing that we struggle with at harvest time is crane damage. So yeah, I don't know if people have questions or comments that want to kind of discuss this stuff, or you want me to go through the other locations and we can come back to data slides.
Is North Dakota Genesis on your list? I don't see it.
Yep, ND Genesis is on the
there it
left,
is.
kind of towards the middle here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. It actually did well this year, particularly I think at KBS when we looked at that one. Unfortunately, we didn't have Odyssey in ESBN. The plots of Odyssey that Ryan was looking at the video were actually part of a Michigan crop improvement study that was run alongside ESBN this year. So no Odyssey ESBN data. Genie, you can see though, which is another one that seems to potentially have promise for Michigan based on past years, is actually the lowest yielding this year. So it goes to show that 1 year never really tells the full story.
Yeah, the disease rating on Genie is super high too. So if you remember that node, that like kind of, how far it was, those LCS varieties from the North Dakota State germplasm. And so you can see Pinnacle, it's known for being susceptible to foliar disease, also has a high disease rating in this case. But ND Genesis is much improved, which was released after Pinnacle. The downside for Genesis for Michigan, though, is it is a usual suspect for sprout. I haven't known anyone that's tried to grow it at field scale without having pre-harvest sprout present. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think we're going to have several quality issues because of the disease in Michigan this year. We had pretty poor grain fill, so I think that we're going to have a lot of thin kernels. I think that we're probably potentially going to have sprout issues as well. Don, could be in there. You saw the conditions the day that Ryan was out shooting the video, was near harvest, and it was a misty morning. We had several small rain events, just the right kind of conditions for sprout. So I would doubt that Chatham will be on the list for malting this year in the ESBN, but yet to be seen. Posen's a very similar story. I think their conditions or weather conditions this year were very similar. You can see their average disease rating was just a little bit lower, but still pretty bad. And they did actually have samples into the diagnostic lab to confirm that it was spot blotch at the Posen location. And so I think for similar reasons, the breakdown of variety yields here is somewhat similar. And we'll look at disease rating by yield in just a minute. And you can see though, I think probably at Chatham and Posen this year, we lost almost half of our yield potential to the disease that we experienced based on historic yields. Hickory Corners, unfortunately, I couldn't get the heading data and foliar disease data in there just yet. That has been collected, but unfortunately I don't have it in here. But you can see their yields were much better. Usually we up north of the Posen and Chatham locations can out yield Hickory Corners pretty significantly, but they beat us quite squarely this year. And but excuse me, by the looks of the plots, I would guess that probably their quality is going to be a lot better. And in a less disease pressured environment, I think that the breakdown of yields here probably is maybe more representative of what we've seen in some previous years, where we don't have all that disease that are kind of shaking things up. But yeah, other than that, I don't know, Ryan or Brooke or Dean, if you have comments on the KBS location this year, anything unusual that you saw or thoughts that you have.
Yeah, I have one quick comment. Disease pressure didn't appear to be too bad, but we used Miravis Ace on our plots, which I think in the UP, did you use Prosaro? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So, and we've been seeing in our fungicide trials that Miravis Ace has a lot better control of the foliar disease, whereas Prosaro really just targets the fusarium. And there were a couple of spots. Hold on.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Can everybody hear me? Everybody get my Siri going in there?
Yeah, we heard both of you.
Anyways, we didn't have much disease, but where we missed with the fungicide, the disease was terrible. So I think that might have been a big player, is we used a product that controlled disease, even though like it wasn't a great year for growing spring barley, but maybe a difference maker.
Yeah, this year's experience really has us thinking about more foliar disease work. It reminds me of previous experience in wheat in northern Michigan. We often have pretty bad foliar disease in wheat, powdery mildew especially, but we have rust, we have other issues as well. And on the other hand, Don really very rarely rears its head in northern Michigan, and I think that that really has to do with rotational diversity and lack of alternative hosts like corn that we have up north. So I really do think, like in wheat, that probably we get a lot more money out of a foliar disease application. A lot of people like to go with your herbicide, but I think it's probably too early because we do want to protect the flag leaf. So if we can get it out of Miravis Ace and get both types of protection, or if it's a 2-pass with a foliar application at maybe flag leaf and then coming back for flowering for Dawn, I do think that we just can't. Like you do manage Dawn, I think that we need to be proactive and prophylactically manage foliar disease in northern Michigan, because we see it probably every other year at least, it seems like. Let's see. I thought it'd be interesting just across locations to take a look at this. So, realize that there's tons of variability because we're talking about all 3 locations here, but it does give you a sense of rises to the top, even in a challenging year for Michigan at large. And again, some of the experimental numbered material from North Dakota, and then some of the KWS varieties, not necessarily ones that we've looked at real closely, like Jesse, but Fantex was one that has been on the list, kind of rising to the top in that cluster analysis from 2018. Again, Genie right down there at the bottom, not what we would probably predict, but maybe without that disease pressure, we would see a different result, and that would be kind of bumped up there closer to the other KWS lines. And then the only other thing I have for today is just looking at our disease rating. I thought it was, interesting to see, did the disease that we rated actually influence yield? And this was the 2 locations that we had those disease ratings for Posen and Chatham. And again, it was a 0 to 5. We didn't have any 0, 1s or 2s, but you can see, we went from a 40 bushel average at a 2 down closer to a 20 bushel average at a 4. And a 0 or 1 may have been up near that 60, 50 or 60 bushel. So we definitely saw some serious yield loss from the disease that we had this year, even on a relative categorical scale like this. So that's all I've prepared for today. I'd love to just spend time talking to all of you about what you're seeing and what do you think the future holds for this crop in Michigan.
Can I say something, James?
Yeah.
Taryn. So ESMA, I noticed, was really high in the yield on most of your sites. After 3 years of pretty solid evaluations in Ontario, they decided to go with ESMA. It really beat out all the Western Canadian stuff, which gets trialed in Ontario. It was a % lower protein, always than Newdale, which was their spring 2-row Czech malting quality variety, % lower protein and better sprout resistance. So ESMA is essentially posed to game change Ontario, right? Their biggest risk was the same as we experienced in New York with spring variety. Too high protein because of drought stress in June, not enough rain in June, and then ridiculous amount of pre-sprout because we're getting all of our rain in August, right? The exact opposite of what we want. And so Newdale, Synergy, they get creamed, right? This year, all throughout Ontario, New York, and Maine, there's really not much other barley in New England, but it's mostly in Maine. The average protein content for Newdale was 14%, right? But ESMA was 12, right? So imagine if there wasn't so much drought stress, right? And your Newdale was 12, your ESMA might be 10 and a half, 11. So keep an eye on that one. I mean, obviously, you got to see how the malt quality looks in Michigan. And then it has that European, type profile, sort of slightly lower dissect power, but really solid extract. So that was interesting to see. We're really excited about ESMA for Ontario. In the cluster diagram, I mean, you've already closed your screen there, but if you want to pull it up again, but you don't have to, Rich generates this clustering based on the data, right? And what's fascinating to me is how phenotypic and how close the families are by breeding program, right? And for me, this really speaks to the inbreeding, that's going on in the programs, right? So this is the data, right, that supports this. So the circle, that's all the European stuff, right? That's the KWS program and the Lima program. And then down just below the red circle, Copeland, Synergy, Newdale, Metcalf, that is the Western Canadian elite material, right? The most elite material. It all meets the sort of very narrow, to get a malting barley registered in Canada, it's not like AMBA. It's not a pay to play. They have to meet the requirements, right? And quality has a veto. And so that's the elite Canadian, Western Canadian stuff. Then to the stuff just to the right of that, Meredith, Bentley, and Cerveza, that's the tier 2 Canadian stuff. Those are the Canadian varieties, the Western Canadian varieties that never really made it. The data looked okay, but the industry rejected them firmly and with resound, right? So those are the also rans. And then you've got Rich Horsley's stuff, the North Dakota stuff, way up on its own, right? And they're all related to each other, right? Conlon, Pinnacle, and Genesis. So to me, that really emphasizes the fact that when the data breaks down by breeding program, essentially, how phenotypic barley is and how the breeding programs are really breeding for what I consider narrow adaptation, right? They're, the Western Canadian stuff does terrible, usually for disease and other things when you take it out of its place. Synergy actually has great yield all over the place. That's strange. But, these programs are really tight. And the quality profile, what we might call the quality profile, right? So, lower dissect power with the European stuff is sort of baked in and hardwired. To me, that was so fascinating to see the breeding. It was essentially clustering by breeding program.
Yeah. It's a really good point. It kind of, it makes you wonder about the strategy of the ESBN. It's nice that we have several different programs represented, but then you look at the locations and, how do those align with where that material originates from and how similar are those environments? Yeah.
I think really, the ESBN was the most valuable thing we ever did, because in the lack of local breeding programs, right? You don't have a breeding program in Michigan for spring barley, right? Mark Sorrells started a breeding program 4 years ago in New York. And we all know that 4 years, 5 years is not enough time, right, to develop a variety, an elite variety. I think that the ESBN provided just the most value to all of our locations through this screening. You got to go out there. You got to look for a range of different candidates from a range of different breeding programs, and you got to try them, right? There was no other way to ever know that Odyssey would kill in Michigan. You guys are so lucky that you can use Odyssey. And in New York, it was the lowest yielding variety every year, right? And there's no way to know that without doing these uniform trials. So it's been, I think, one of the most beneficial things to malting barley in the non-traditional growing areas. It's been amazing.
My only disappointment has been that we didn't look at enough varieties. You know, you got to stop somewhere, right? But you know, there's a couple varieties that were on the top of my list that didn't show up there, but they would have landed on that chart somewhere near the Fantex. But I was specifically thinking Tinka and Josie, and Josie is not Jesse, right? That I don't know Jesse. That's a new one for me. So maybe you guys don't know, all right? But yeah, to me, it's totally obvious that the barley is bred for the kind of beer that they're making or their style of brewing, right? And that's the whole deal. Just what you said, Aaron. I mean, you can see it in that chart. And then you start adding other quality parameters on to those that you're looking at. And even those will separate now into different dimensions. And then you really start to see stuff, right? Because some of those varieties you could probably just knock right off the list because they produce hazy wort. Or, I mean, I can pick a bunch of things at random for knocking them off. But, and then the key, the trick is, how do we find something, you know, with the high yield, right? I mean, those yields, gosh, was that the worst year I've seen out of Chatham and Posen? Is that the worst I've ever seen? I don't think it's been that bad before, has it?
Yeah, it's about the worst year we've had. Yeah, there's been other years that are probably on par, but one of the worst. Yep.
Well, those, I mean, the year to me looks, just looking at the data that you showed, it looks just like a disaster. The whole thing, unfortunately. And you say that was driven by disease?
That was the main culprit. I think that, you know, we could see in the field was just you know, the flag leaf was gone before the grain was filled. It was just that devastating. The entire plant, you know, was covered in leaf.
The weather, or?
I think so. I mean, we were very wet this year in the Upper Peninsula. We had very regular precipitation. And I think that just that consistent leaf wetness probably is what got us. I don't know. Other than that, temperature wise, you know, it wasn't that unusual. We had some more hot days, I would say, than the average year. But yeah, in general, I think it was the disease that killed us.
Was it the best soybean year you've had in a while also?
Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, we grew beans like I've never seen this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I've observed. You know, the warmer it gets, the worse spring barley does. And
yeah, it was, in fact, like, you know, record breaking beyond memory corn for the Upper Peninsula. So yeah, absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah, it was it was shocking going to Posen after having been at KBS, walking the barley fields there. KBS's barley was beautiful this year, not to brag, but I think regarding the ESBN, those low disease ratings and the Enrich's experimentals really speaks to the quality of him meeting his breeding targets, because those are varieties that he selects for Eastern environments. So I'm really satisfied with that, and it's kind of sad that it's ending, but Rich's breeding program goes on, so we're just going to have to actively seek that out with intention.
But remember, Ryan, there's trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Conlon, Pinnacle, and Endiogenesis are not the varieties we really want to be malting.
Absolutely not.
No.
So, you know, I think disease, obviously, like, of course, disease is important, but in a malting barley breeding program, I just think you have to prioritize quality early in the program so that by the time you get to advanced material, it's got the quality.
You're right. Disease resistance is always a metabolic trade-off. So whenever the plant has to mount resistance efforts, everything else suffers. And it's usually yield, accumulation of biomass, all that stuff. So starch.
Can I interject? I would interject only that sometimes, being that I'm a farmer too, I would gladly trade off the ease of malting for pre-harvest sprout resistance. Like if there's a barley breeding program specifically for Michigan, I would think that they would side with the farmer and choose to, I would like to see a variety come out that's more posed to be like Conlin is. Obviously, we love that variety here because it's what we can grow, and we're willing to put in the extra effort in the malt house to bring out great quality malt. And I do think that we have great quality malt, so it's possible to take a challenging variety and make great malt with it, even if it's, you know, not as easy to process. To me, if you had a Michigan barley breeding program, that's going to be part of the goal.
A risk you can understand, you can predict and mitigate is different than a risk that you have no control over. So yes. I think that that's a very good point in that sense that, you know, sprout is just, I mean, yeah, timeliness of harvest, I guess, is the one thing you can do, right? But otherwise it's up to God and the weather. So, yeah. But you can adjust your process.
I see all the barley breeding programs sort of not trying to do the same direction, but there isn't one that's trying to breed for sprout resistance. Not selectively as that, you know, where is the new variety that's specifically resistant, even if it is a real bear to have to malt. You know, the Conlins of the world are disappearing.
Alison, I can vouch for the fact that you make an excellent product from the Conlin, but you work very hard at it. You work very hard to do that, to overcome some of the inherent, you know, shall we say, limitations of the quality there. So
like
there's definitely limitations in the malt house, but I would say that, you know, I can't give up on this point because I am also the farmer and I really enjoy watching it grow in the field. It's got to be the most rewarding part of all of it. Seeing that barley grow is just unlike anything else we do. So
and I can vouch for the quality of Alison's fields.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a general question here from Tom. And this is open to anyone who wants to chime in to answer it. So in our region, Tom's in Ohio, so it's nearly all winter barley down there. Here up in Michigan, we've got a gradient. As you go north, it's more spring. And then we experienced some winter kill last year or the year before significantly. So spring was a good backup, you know, if you didn't get what you needed out of winter barley. So what are the benefits and drawbacks to farmers of spring versus winter? And also that same question in terms of maltsters, so spring versus winter. I know extract is going to come to the top of that answer for maltsters. And then for farmers, you know, what about double cropping? Should that really be a consideration when we're talking about malting contracts in spring versus winter? So whoever wants to jump on that hot topic first.
Brooke, you want to hit that one?
Yeah, if and when we can grow winter barley, I much prefer it over spring barley. The disease, the seasonality of completing the work, the phenology of the plant in relation to the weather and the difficult challenges, the timing when dawn or, you know, fusarium is likely to be a problem, when weeds are likely to be a problem, and then just the overall yield and ability to push yield without worrying about pushing protein levels too high. Also an advantage there with winter barley. So from a farmer's perspective, much preferred winter barley over spring barley in southern Michigan.
Cereal leaf beetle too, I think, right?
Yeah.
And that would hold for Ohio and New York, right? In those climates where you could choose one or the other, winter barley by far will benefit the farmer.
We were also talking about sprout. Don't we see greater dormancy in the winter barley crop that would protect against sprout as well?
So there's a range, James. Remember, like, it's not fair to say, well, all winter barleys have dormancy and all springs don't, right? There's a range, and you can find both dormant and, you know, sprout susceptible varieties on both. So for instance, in the winters, we have Endeavor, which is essentially the synergy of the winters, right? It's a very hot, winter two-row, one of the very few North American bred winters, but there's a much on the side of more dormancy. There are far more commercialized winter varieties available right now that have much more dormancy if you want it, all the way up to like Calypso. So LCS Calypso has months of post-harvest ripening time. And so, we essentially will never see a sample pre-sprouted. You could just leave it out there. But, we're looking at very long waiting times to get any kind of decent malting performance without the use of, trickery. But I think what we have in the winters is a broader range of choice, right? So we have everything from sort of TP, Endeavor, which is extremely hot, TP Scala, which have a little bit, but you should still timely harvest them. Then Violetta is probably the most moderate. Violetta has good protection, decent malt quality, and then Calypso has a lot of profound dormancy.
Yeah, so our take on that has been biased by the varieties that we're growing in Michigan and what we're seeing come through the lab, a lot of Calypso in particular, and the issues with dormancy. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but there's certainly non-dormant winters as well. But I think what we have in the commercial right now setting is more choices. There are very few choices in spring when it comes to commercially just going out and getting varieties, right? It's just, we don't have as much choice.
It's true.
Alyssa pointed out too in the chat that there are ecological reasons to choose winter barley because of the extended growing season, the ability to capture nutrients in the soil that may otherwise be lost, and just generally utilizing available energy from sunlight that's not there if we're planting in the spring.
For Tom's benefit, I think we should talk about the malting properties. Like Vince, maybe you have some insight to tell us, offer us on the malting side when we move into winter varieties, especially when we start looking at varieties with more dormancy. What are we trading off?
Yeah, I'm still not convinced that pre-harvest sprout resistance and dormancy are the same thing.
No.
So I just want to say that, okay? I know there's already varieties that we've looked at that have resistance that don't show dormancy like Calypso does. You already said that, Aaron. For crying out loud.
I think what you're saying is that there's dormancy, and then there's what you're talking about is after ripening, right? So we have you want dormancy with fast after ripening, so that you don't have to wait 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think you could split it off that way.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen grain turn. I've seen grain turn from 25% germination to 100 in a matter of a week's time. It just flipped over. And you never know when that flip over is going to happen, and that's the problem, right? So if you're getting a barley that does have lots of dormancy, you never know if it's going to be ready to malt, in 6 months, or if it's going to be ready to malt in 2 months. And the only really way to handle that then is storage, or you can malt it raw and definitely live with the product you can make out of it that way, because you can definitely malt it.
There's no way to predict that.
Huh?
So it's a data gathering problem, James. So what we're doing right now, if you look at the ESBN using stirring number, we're getting a really good differential at most sites on pre-harvest sprout resistance. So let's call that, for the sake of argument, dormancy. Let's just use the word, right? Which means at the time when the rain comes, the thing is kind of sleeping, closed off, right? So you get the rain and you can tolerate it, right? So the stirring number remains high. Okay, so we know that that's beneficial. So then we harvest them up and we go on, and that's the last data point that we gather. What Vince is talking about is, what if we assess the germination right at harvest, and then assess the germination a month after harvest, 2 months after harvest, 3 months after harvest? If we could do that in a timely way, right, you would get an additional data points, right, which would show you how fast does that dormancy break, or what we call after ripening, right? And it's not the same for all the varieties, which is what Vince mentioned. We're not gathering that data, right, in the ESPN.
Is that information available otherwise? Because that's something Chris has been asking to do, when we're talking about kind of what the next step is, because he's seen that difference, and we just have no information to be able to tell people or predict.
You do it. So I have gathered that information, right?
Yeah.
And so for me and the places that I present and our clients, we share that information with them. So we've been monitoring a group of varieties for 2 years now, right? To watch that speed of after ripening, and it becomes very clear, right?
You
Calypso's
pick
the
your-
longest, Violetta's intermediate, Scala, you know, is like Vince says, like it only takes a week and it flips over. So you just need to gather that data and develop that intelligence package and then disseminate it. I'll say a couple of things about one thing about the ESPN. It's been a very valuable program, but the data has not been well disseminated. And frankly, Michigan, you have done better than anyone else. I go to your website, the data is there. It takes too long. It takes too long to get the malt data, but you guys are the only ones who every year put the data on the web. You know, Cornell, Vermont, you never see it.
I second that. I second that.
And it's a credit to you guys, because I'll tell you, I have found that a lot of people out there do the work, and then we never see the data, and it's all for nothing if we can't get the data to the stakeholders. So I'll give you high praise for publishing the data.
Cheers.
Can we
Thank you.
circle back
Yeah,
for
thank you.
just a second? I want to make a comment. When we talk about pre-harvest sprout resistance, I think it was already established that dormancy and water sensitivity are not only not linked, but the rate of water uptake, so rain events or duration of wet periods, contributes largely to PHS. So dormancy would definitely, whenever I think about a barley becoming susceptible to PHS, it has to do with water uptake rate, the rate that it absorbs the water from the rain. Am I the only person that's looking at that, Aaron?
The issues are interrelated, right?
Yeah.
So if you
Yeah,
took,
kind of, but-
they're interrelated, but not clear. You're right. I think the mechanisms are not clear, Alison, because if they were, we would just spew it out like fact. And
Well,
the fact that we debate it means that it's not clear. But all of those things you mentioned, sprout susceptibility, rate of water uptake, water
Yeah.
sensitivity, and dormancy are all interrelated somehow physiologically. And it's not 100% clear. We know that if you take the same variety and grow it in 2 different environments, and one has a very prolonged wet and cool maturing period, then you end up with grain that is more water sensitive, that takes up water more quickly.
I was so proud of the fact that we grew Violetta this year. We made some mistakes with like getting our field prep just right. And we had some, basically things that we learned, of course, but the winter barleys are fascinating to me because of this whole vernalization and cold, maturation factor, coming into play. I think I'm certainly keen on trying the winter varieties again, and MSU is doing a really great variety trial on our field over here, but I really love spring barley because to me, I associate it with plump kernels, and it's what we know really well. But and it's also, to us, we don't really see disease pressure in our home. I always am talking pretty much about our county, but the sand here has reduced the disease pressure. It always just comes down to PHS. So, but yeah, we're really trying to understand it. And if I heard that Genesis was like a next generation of Pinnacle, that would kind of make me intrigued, but not quite what I'm hearing. When I look at varieties, I see North Dakota breeding lines, European and Canadian, much like you said, Aaron. It's just exactly how I see it.
I believe the Genesis ended up being a lodging variety in the end. And that's what they did in North Dakota anyway. And it never lasted 2 years maybe. But it all fell over and got wet, and which a lot of people said there was a lot of pre-harvest sprout in it. A lot of people said there's a lot of dawn in it, but basically it fell over and touched the ground, and barley's no good then, right?
So it's a taller variety, right?
Well, it lodges, meaning it falls over. Yeah, it's a taller variety that actually falls over, unfortunately. So it never did what they thought it was going to do in North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it was going to be the dawn resistance, right? The dawn fighter is what it was supposed to be, but it turned into a losing game.
Hey, Aaron, so on that dormancy that you were talking about, tracking it like you said you've been doing it, are you finding consistency within varieties, or at least so it is something you could test a couple of years and at least have direction that says you're going to have to wait 3 months or you're going to have to wait 6 months, or it's not like that varies dramatically within a variety, or does it?
So the speed of the after ripening phenotype is pretty stable. Like it's definitely genetically controlled.
Okay.
So for instance, we always see that Calypso takes longer, right? It's a bear. Now, I do not translate that into storage time recommendations because there's too many other variables, right? It depends on how that grain was treated after harvest. So for instance, we have found that if you dry the grain with a holding period, now we're experimenting with a couple people in Ohio with this right now. So we get the grain off at 16 to 18% moisture. And then we dry it with a holding time at 45 degrees Celsius, which is really pushing the limits of what most of the North American drying literature says on barley. But we dry it with heat, right? And what it does, it seems to sort of speed the after ripening, right? It pushes, and this is from the UK. So if you looked historically in the UK, they wouldn't malt during the fall, during the harvest period. That's because they were using their kilns to dry the barley, right? So as the barley was being harvested, 14, 16% moisture, they put it in the kiln, and in one day they bring it down to 11. And it was really important that they do that because not just for the long-term germination preservation, but to speed the after ripening, right? To speed the release of dormancy and to reduce the water sensitivity, right? And so there's too many variables to say, oh, if you've put your Calypso in the bin, it'll be ready to malt after X months, because it depends how it was treated after storage, the moisture content, the temperature, how it's being sort of handled in the bin. There's too many variables. So I don't see it from here's a recommendation on post-harvest storage. It's a recommendation on managing risk. Like Brooke said earlier, you've got to pick the risk that you can't manage and then select your variety, right? So it's a great example how Alison says, well, we want to manage pre-harvest sprout risk. So they grow conlin and some other agronomic reasons, and they'll deal with it in the malt house later. And someone else might be like, oh no, we can harvest at 20% and we have post-harvest drying. So pre-harvest sprout isn't a risk for us. Great. Well, then you can choose a variety that maybe performs in the malt house the way you want. So you've got to choose. And so I think the information is more so to help people choose.
Can I pose a question to the group? So as I mentioned, this was the last year of the ESBN being funded by BA. So what's next? We've thought about different things. Right now, the plan is to try to roll the ESBN concept into another funding source that we have that was new this year, the Michigan Crop Improvement Association. We ran a feed and milling focused oat and barley trial through them this year. Perhaps we can just expand the barley component, including more malting varieties, and run it that way. Of course, it's only Michigan locations. Another thought is, do something other than variety testing. Look at more what's happening post-harvest, like we just discussed. Trying to improve our methods or look more closely at what's happening in the lab instead. What should we be doing in terms of supporting variety development, variety selection for spring barley in the state?
Go for it, Alison.
I mean, to be honest, our big difficulty, so going into next year, what we're doing, we've reworked a little bit of our storage, and we have extended our network of growers that we're talking to, and we are definitely giving people a list of all options available. If they know that there's a variety that they're familiar with that they can grow at their farm, that's what we want them to grow. Because at this point, I don't have a second favorite variety in mind. I kind of am getting there, but I guess we're setting up to take in more varieties than we were previously, because I think going forward, that's going to be the best way to handle Michigan barley. As far as where to go, we need more work on rotations for our little corner of the north. I mean, we plant sorghum because we can afford to do it. It's worth it to us, but that's like my number one problem with farmers. Year in, year out, we're on year 7 and they're still lacking a profitable rotation crop, really. I'm encouraging them to try soybeans, but we just don't have the daylight hours is the feedback I'm getting. So possibly research on, rotation crops and what they're doing to build the soil, help me convince the farmers that it's worth it to do something besides rye in between the barley, because it's obviously so detrimental.
That's an interesting one. Soybeans were one of our favorites as a rotational crop. We would always try to go into beans in Posen, or follow beans, I should say. And you can certainly grow beans where you're at. We've got a lot of great information. We do soybean variety testing that we can help support people to select appropriate soybean varieties for that part of the state. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I hadn't even thought about kind of rotational challenges.
That's got to be my number one complaint with our local group here. I'm pretty excited about a couple new farmers that we're working with that are growing organic winter barley. They had just the most beautiful, perfect kernels. There was some wild garlic, but otherwise they had really amazing results. So I'm really excited to see what they're doing and start talking to them more. I have some fascination with companion cropping using white clover. But that's sort of down the road. I just want to leave it alone and see what they come up with. They're doing just 30 acres this year of organic Violetta, but man, I was so impressed with that this year. They're just a little bit south of us on the western part of the state.
Red clover into wheat is really well established. So that, that's a great idea for diversification and weed control in an organic system.
I would just mention that I'm interested in that aspect of companion cropping to help crowd out weeds with a variety like Violetta that has maybe a little less vigor. Because so when we talked earlier about foliar fungicide application, we had a year back when we did use a strobil urine foliar fungicide, and I felt that was potentially detrimental to the crop. We had more microbial staining on that section. So it's just sort of interesting. I think sometimes it's a trade-off when you use chemical applications. The barley is a sensitive crop. Certainly we know that with herbicides. So I'm just kind of mentioning some topics that are things I'm focused on right now.
Yeah, that's helpful.
We always want more seed, more varieties to be available. More, it seems like there's a few more every year, which is really wonderful.
The seed availability thing, I think, is a real constraint. It's one thing to run these variety trials, but if growers can't get their hands on these varieties, who cares, right? So it is a little bit absurd, yeah, when you're trying to source this stuff. So that would be something that wouldn't require a grant or research per se, but just trying to facilitate seed production in different ways, encourage more seed growers and expand the varieties that they're growing.
That was kind of Vince's point, though, that selection has to go quicker to the or Aaron, I forget who that was, has to go quicker to that quality output in the malt house. If agronomics alone, and then malt house, and then the brew house. But I think is it possible only as a layperson on the data that there's quite a bit of microclimate impact on spring barley, say maybe more than winter barley. I just don't know. Even though probably maybe it's equal. I'm not gonna say that. So I'd like to see some microclimate. As Allison said, her little corner, I get it. But you go across New York and you could sit down in every conversation somebody says microclimate, and I get I believe it and I see it, but I'd like to be able to see if we can maybe get some of that data together so that we can understand where there are microclimates and then the relative impact on those from time to time. And I think that might help us because I think this is the Canadian data that I saw help us really determine that dividing line between winter survivability and yields, spring barley yields.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I saw.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We are in the process of trying to learn more about microclimate effects on winter barley right now. We've got, let's see, is it 5 locations that we have planted with different winter barley varieties. There's 7 winter barleys and a rye check. And we're collecting a lot of microclimate information, temperature, light as a proxy for snow cover, relative humidity at those individual locations rep by rep, so that we can actually try to see where that line is. And I don't, when we think about that line in terms of latitude, that is a really gross oversimplification, because it's all about the interactions of the microclimate parameters that you're talking about, right? Temperature and snow cover, growing degree day accumulation in the fall based on plant date. But anyway, through that Craft Beverage Council funded proposal or project that we have active right now, we're hoping to learn a lot more about that. We selected winter barley varieties that rated poorly on winter hardiness, on cold hardiness and winter injury, and ones that rated really highly based on the WMBT. And so we try to create this divide in the genetics, and then trying to understand some of the mechanisms as well. So not only what climate metrics are influencing that or correlated with what we see in terms of injury and survival, but then also we're collecting tissue samples, and we've got some colleagues, Emily Merowitz home at MSU, who's a turfgrass physiologist who's kind of getting into grain, and then also Nikhil Jaikumar, he's coming out of a postdoc at Illinois, that are doing some genetic work on that material as well, to try to look at some of the actual mechanisms behind winter hardiness or cold hardiness, and looking at things like DNA repair and how the plants deal with oxidative stress as well. So I'm really excited about it. I think it's more basic science than we often do in our group here. And I think it should hopefully tell us a lot about what the potential for winter barley is in Michigan, and are there genetics out there that can really help us get it done even further north or more consistently in the state from year to year.
Aaron would know that it's the Mennonite farmers. They know where the line is.
Yeah, soil health has a huge role in determining fungal populations above the ground too. So yeah, and that plays into microclimate as well. I'd like to point out too that Alison, where she's at in Empire, as the crow flies, isn't really that far from Posen, where we had terrible disease. So yeah, definitely a microclimate factor going on there. Anecdotally, I worked with some folks up by Charlevoix who are sheep farmers that were growing Lacey, which is a 6-row malting variety to feed to their sheep. They followed corn 2 years in a row. 2 years in a row, they were at the top quality-wise of all the samples I received. So yeah, microclimate, you can do everything wrong and still get a good result, maybe, but no. There's factors there that we just don't know yet and are hard to quantify. So
I can also say that we don't have a perfect track record either. I mean, we've certainly had challenging years. And if anything, I would say that we've had, like last year, for example, our yields were pretty high. And when we say high yielding, 55 bushels to the acre, we're pretty happy with that. And we still had like almost approaching, microbial activity, almost pre-harvest sprout type of thing going on. So we're definitely not perfect. Our microclimate sometimes, I think, has minimal impact. I think there's other things that are going on that maybe are just theories of mine, but if we look at who has in the whole world the highest malting barley quality yields, who is it? It's New Zealand. And why is that? The farmers there, I believe they attribute it to the sun, their sun strength. So sort of just a random theory of mine, but there's a solar cycle and we're in a deep solar minimum right now. So maybe that's why the fields were cold and short this year. Our yields were certainly not record breaking this year. It wasn't our best year, but I think the more time that we have more records of barley cultivation, the more we'll start to understand maybe there is something to a sensitive Northern Michigan malting barley crop if the sun intensity is on a 10-year cycle and we're in a deep minimum. Maybe that is part of it.
Yeah, having spent a lot of time in Scotland, there was I don't think there wasn't a day that I wasn't pretty soppy though. So I do have to say we need to think about, where it does. I've seen, we know the quality you put out, and it's being able to go through the adversity and then be able to have a beautiful crop. And I agree with you. The charisma of malting barley is a pleasure. So I agree. Planting and watching it grow, and there are also other organic acres out there this year that I know of.
The organic crops in Michigan are just the most incredible achievement to me. Really amazing, and such a great aspect that can give us a lot of hope. If people are able to do that, that really shows us that we need to be open-minded about the steps we're taking and kind of keep good records and observe everything. But yeah, definitely to me, it's about pulling off a crop even in the challenging years, because this year was not like 2016 was.
Speaking of microclimates, in my part of the world, our problem is just no rain in June and July. So an issue I'd be interested in is how to irrigate barley, whether that's winter or spring. Campus here has their centipivot set up now, so doing some more trials there specifically aimed at looking at watering rates and when to water relative to yield and disease. Would be of interest to me for sure. Other issue is, we talk about all this barley that doesn't make malt quality. It's got pre-harvest spout. It's got down. Developing that secondary market in terms of animal feed is something we really need to work on, because we wouldn't feel as bad about some barley not coming out well if we had some value to it at that point. At this point, it just has almost no value. So it's a total loss to the farmer and us too. But if we could sell that reasonably for animal feed, then we wouldn't feel as bad about these crops that don't come out as well.
Yeah, really good points, Larry. I hadn't thought about the irrigation one. That's very interesting. That would be something to look at. On the feed side, I've got a call actually tomorrow with a newer faculty member at MSU that is doing some interesting feeding work with barley to look at how it relates to feed efficiency, but also to climate change risk. And I think that is so compelling, the idea that we could feed malted barley or perhaps just sprouted barley and have better feed efficiency and also reduce methane emissions in the cattle production system at the same time. I I don't know, if that will be a potential alternative market for us, because I don't think, we're not going to convince the whole world, or we're not going to convince the US to switch from corn based diets back to barley wholesale, as long as cheap corn is available. But if there were some motivations to do so, such as improve feed efficiency or reduced emissions, maybe there would be some subsidization or incentive to incorporate some amount of barley in the ration.
Yeah, Ryan's had me in touch with JK. So we've talked, and I've toured JK around my place. So I think, yeah, the concept of reducing methane, improving the meat quality, but also I point out that there's a lot of people that don't like GMOs. So if we raise beef with barley, we can say it's GMO-free beef as well, and that's a selling point.
Yeah, that is actually a big deal up here at the local feed mills. Is there definitely is a segment that does not want GM feed, even for freezer meat, home consumption especially. And yeah, they're either going barley, or we have one or two growers that are producing some non-GM corn. But you know what it's like growing corn up here. So yeah, it is really intriguing. I totally agree. Between risk management tools, insurance, and alternative markets, those are two of the linchpins, absolutely, for the state.
Yeah, for anyone on this call that wasn't able to attend or hasn't already watched it, our session with JK and Larry that focuses a lot on that, and pretty much solely on feeding sprouted grains to cattle for the purposes James was talking about, is up on the YouTube channel. I can provide a link to that in the chat too. But first, I'd like to revisit Tom's questions and revisit them verbatim. And I think Brooke adequately addressed the farmer aspect of that, but I don't think we really touched on everything there was to talk about the maltster question. But I'm going to read it verbatim just to make sure that I don't miss anything. Benefits to farmers of spring versus winter, including the downside of not being able to double crop. Down in Ohio, their farmers got 30 bushel per acre of beans this year, and that was a bad year even. So the benefits to the maltster of spring versus winter, I think maybe is what we didn't quite get adequate coverage on. I think Vince is maybe not on the call.
Vince looked like he left.
Plum kernels.
There seems
We
to be,
associate spring barleys with plum kernels, certainly. Extract.
yeah, there's this kind of like conventional wisdom that winter barley can't touch the extract of spring barley, and the throwaway explanation of that is that it's just hasn't been paid attention to enough in breeding programs in the past.
I agree with that. There's potential.
Which could be exactly why, but I'd like to know if anyone has any thoughts, specifically Aaron, on if there are other possibly confounding factors in that, or if it's just breeding targets.
It basically comes down to the cluster that you saw, right? There's essentially no elite winter malting barley breeding going on in the US, right? So there's Endeavor and Charles, which are very elite malting quality, very sprout susceptible, right? So they're essentially just like our springs, right? So, but they don't help you much in terms of advantages. So if we look at most of the winter barleys that are being grown from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York and south, all the way down to, Virginia, North Carolina, then you're really left with the European material. So then you are left with a European style malting profile. If the protein's managed low, as Vince would remind us, TP under very low protein management, you can get excellent extract, 82, 83, no problem, but the enzymes will not be there, right? So that means struggling or, needing to lengthen the malting process or use aids such as gibberellic acid to get diacetylic power and alpha amylase up to where a North American brewer would expect them becomes much harder with a winter. And that's just because of the nature of the breeding program, the nature of the expectation of the European brewers, and frankly, the history of sort of malting in Europe, right? So the idea that the malting process will be 7 days, this is a very North American concept, right? And everyone who goes to get trained in malting at the Malt Academy up in Winnipeg gets trained in malting a Western Canadian spring model, right? Which is now more like 6 days, 6 to 7 days. And that is not the case in Europe, right? All French winter 2-row is 8 days, and the French winter 6-row is 9 days. And that's just how it is. And they accept that. And so I know that in your malt house, that can mean a difference in your economics, right? How many turns of your equipment that you can do. And that's just a fact, right? So, Violetta, to get, what we consider the North American style enzyme package, that is not going to happen in 7 days with some of these winter varieties, unless you use gibberellic acid, do other things. So the biggest trade-off when it comes to spring and winter, as far as the varieties that are available and established and well understood, is the malting quality profile in terms of how essentially it will process in your facility and meeting the brewer's expectations. That's just, for North Americans, that's just going to be easy. I'll just use the word easier. Malting is never easy, but easier with a spring and maybe a little more challenging with a winter. Doesn't mean that we can't have phenomenal winter malt. We can. It just means you have to process it with that mindset.
Excellent. Tom, is there something specifically regarding malting process you wanted to know about a winter versus spring? You're muted, by the way.
I think that Aaron's, pretty familiar with what my guys do, and the brewers are happy. They're getting, north of 80% brew house efficiency with the Scala that we malt. So, and Scala's a pretty plump kernel, Alison. So take a look at it. But no, I'm happy with the answer.
Scala has really become a bit of a workhouse throughout Ohio and New York, right? 60% of all the winter barley in New York is still Scala. It does have a plump kernel. Its main, difference is the lower enzymes, right? The diastatic power is hovering closer to 100, not closer to like 140. And the alpha amylase between 40 and 50, not, north of 60. And again, I think, with a proper understanding and relationship with your brewers and conversations about expectations, it's very possible that that is sufficient for them. It's just not substitutable, right? I wouldn't like to go into a situation where they, a brewer is using RAR 2-row and then switches over to your Scala, right? I think that could be a bit jarring for them without a conversation. It doesn't mean that the brewing profile of Scala can do perfectly well. It's just not substitutable.
Well, is there something else that would be recommended, either spring or winter, that would be appropriate to the latitudes we're speaking about?
You have the same information that I do, Tom, right? Like, I just look at the data that's coming out of the trials and I see what you see, and they showed it, right? Like on the winter side, no. And on the springtime side, Odyssey, I have to admit that I am not a proponent of more varieties. You need a couple to 3 varieties that are agronomically well suited and meet the needs of your end users. And then you slowly try and introduce a new variety and shuttle out the old varieties. At this point, you don't need more varieties. And I think that could also inform your use of a nursery program going forward. You don't need to screen 15 new varieties every year, right? The ESBN in Michigan, you don't need to do that. And you don't need to screen any experimental varieties because there's no pipeline to commercializing them. So I would suggest that if you're thinking to how are we going to look at a new generation, the ESBN performed its value. In the course of 5 years, you identified a handful of varieties that worked. You were able to eliminate a lot of varieties that didn't. And now you should go on more of a market development standpoint. You should work closely with representatives from KWS and Lima Grain, because that's frankly the 2 programs that have expressed the most interest in commercializing, right? Ackerman, if say you fall in love with some Explorer or whatever, where are you even going to get that seed? You're not going to get it. Ackerman, they're not interested. Syngenta, they're not interested in these markets, right? They're too small. And so you should work closely with the representatives of the seed companies to trial their material, 5 or 6 varieties a year, and, identify the ones that you think maybe, good, generate the data, and then look if there's a space in the portfolio to move away from something like Scala into one of those. And the rationale for moving from Scala to a new variety in Ohio would be demonstrably superior performance, right? If it's the same, you don't change. It would have to be better in terms of agronomics and the same in terms of quality, or the same in agronomics and better in terms of quality, or better for both. And we've been doing this with KWS. So KWS is working with me and then the Cornell guys to have their newest material evaluated every year. And right now, nothing from KWS is demonstrably superior to Scala, right?
No,
Maybe one of them, what's the one that they're really keen on? I think it is Jesse.
Flavia or something like
Oh,
that. Is that
forget
the new one?
Flavia. All the data shows that Flavia is complete dog. And don't listen. I know I'm lecturing you now, but don't listen to what
okay.
people say, right? Like in Virginia, they all just want to grow Flavia, right? Yeah, the growers want to grow Flavia because it has the highest yield, but it has the lowest alpha amylase. So what good is that for you, right? You don't necessarily just, and the other I heard was Faro, right? There's this variety called Faro, KWS. All of a sudden, I heard all this stuff out of Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia that, oh, the yields were spectacular. It turns out it's a winter 6-row. Winter 6-row. No wonder the yields are fantastic. It's basically feed barley, right? Yeah. Once we got it into the lab, beta-glucans 300, I'm like, forget it, right? So we don't need a lot of varieties. You need a variety that you really know well, that meets the needs of your growers and your end users. And then you switch to a new variety when it's shown that it's demonstrably superior. Otherwise, you stick. That's why Copeland has been grown in Western Canada for 20 years, because nothing has come along that's demonstrably superior.
Well,
Can you touch on that? Sorry.
All we ever have grown for the last 4 years is Scala. It's done very well for us. And the key point is you guys talk about microenvironments. From my perspective, barley does not like wet feet, and you've got to have extremely good drainage, and you've got to have an enclosed field that's protected by, nice trees around it. And that's the way you skate through the polar vortexes. That's, it's kind of like microenvironments are not going to protect, or, it's not going to have an effect on the extreme weather conditions that sometimes we've had over the course of the years with both rains and extreme colds without the snow to cover the barley over and protect it. So,
Yeah, but Tom, that's not necessarily the data.
A protected field and good drainage means everything to the farmers.
I agree with your drainage, but the data doesn't. Your data is not necessarily indicating on your winter survivability. That's not necessarily true. It's very genetic, and then after that it's 60 days of respiration if it chokes under ice, which is where you're well drained. That's why your observation for well drained fields is correct. But it's not the winter. It's not winter. It's not snow packed over the field. It's the ability for the plant to respirate at least once in 60 days. I don't really know, but it is very genetic, and that's the beauty of world-class data collection, which I always call MSU. And it was said here before, we have world-class data selection. Let's use the data to help drive that. So, but as a witness to it, the data is very genetic on the winter kill. Winter survivability, sorry.
Tom, contact me if you have some Scala you want to sell.
Oh, we've got a lot of Scala.
Send me an email. Well, I'll talk to you if you want to sell us some.
Well,
love to try it. Sounds good.
Maybe next year, Allison. We're a little short ourselves this year. We were a little on protein in a lot of our fields.
I understand.
There's a lot for both of you in New York. If you're interested, let me know.
Oh yeah. Hey, look, I can put you in contact with a guy up in New York that would be happy to sell you plenty of Scala. Seriously.
He means John Cast, and it's good
John
stuff.
Cast, that's who I'm talking
and it's
about.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a 2,000 ton a year capacity malt house in New York just stopped production this summer. So there's a lot of farmers with a lot of barley, a lot of good barley.
Yeah, and this guy really grows good stuff, and we had very high, wonderful brew house performance out of it. So yeah, let's figure out why don't you put your email address down in the comments box here, and I'll connect you with John Cast.
I'll have to get to you after. I'm on my phone, unfortunately.
All
I'll
right.
get back with you.
West
I will.
Branch Malt. You know where to find me.
Okay, very good. Aaron, will you touch on, is there such thing as a lifetime of a variety in a certain area?
Oh, I mean, they never want to let go of the good ones. You know,
I know.
I think we're not in that danger zone yet, right? So, you know, Metcalf, Harrington before it in Western
Right.
Canada, 20 and 30 years, you know, these varieties. The problem is that at some point agronomically, they're just not as, you know, fit
Right.
as they used to be. And there's just superior things coming out. I think that the attitude of the commercial industry is conservative and to stick with what they know works. And to take not a lot of risks on new varieties, and it's actually very difficult to get them off of the varieties that have worked well for them. But
Right.
I don't know, unless one of the agronomists can speak better. I think if you use certified seed, right, it's not like I think I'm getting out of my area, but maybe Brooke, James can correct me. But if you use certified seed, it doesn't age, right? The varieties I don't think they
Right.
lose anything
No.
over time.
Genetic diversity. It should, as if you're not saving seed, it shouldn't be different.
No,
it's
because they
when
go back, right?
If you save seed and plant it year after year,
That's
Then it's-
different.
then it starts degrading. But certified seed that's grown year after year, that's not the case. I mean, the same, what you're talking about is true with, I mean, I work with organic soybean. I had organic soybean variety trials for quite a few years too. And it's always interesting on these trials and moving to new varieties when you have a number of quality parameters. You know, the organic soybean guys are providing soybeans for soy milk and tofu. So it has protein and oil quality aspects. And you can do a lot of breeding, but to find a high yielding, high quality bean is difficult. You know, you'll find something that's a little higher and you'll find things that are higher in protein and oil content, but invariably they're lower in yield. So you've always got that trade-off when it comes to these types of value-added commodities, for lack of a better way of.
So they'll grow the
putting it.
same variety for a number of years.
There's people growing Vinton 81s yet, and the 81 in Vinton 81 was the year it came out. You know, and that was why we started the program. We said, come on, guys, you know, you're growing Vinton 81s yet? There's got to be something better out there. Well, after 8 years of doing variety trials with an actual breeding program at MSU, we have yet to find something that, you know, they're really ready to jump at to replace something like that. I mean, in general, you know, if you're just going for yield, like you know, most cases you're doing with feed grade soybeans and corn, you know, you can develop something better pretty quickly, you know, a little better disease resistance and increase the yield, and people are all over it. But when you start adding on those additional quality aspects, that makes the breeding job a lot tougher. And it is highly variable by region as well. Just because you get those better quality in one region does not mean you're going to get them in another region.
Absolutely.
You know, the other thing I was going to say, Allison, is don't discount that sand that you're growing that on.
We don't.
You know, there's a reason they grow all that seed corn down in St. Joseph County. They like that sand down there. I mean, it's low diseases. It dries out quick. You know, you don't end up waterlogged. You don't have wet feet. If you've got one of your crosses tends to be a poor performer, but you want it in there, you want to give it every chance of surviving. I'm guessing if we push more spring barley down in Southwest Michigan, I bet it'd probably do as well down there as it does for you?
I think so. We joke that we have glacial deposited rare earth minerals in our sand, so it's not just a void. But I think the sand is a big factor, probably more so than the microclimate.
Well, and I think it points back to the idea of starting to look at things like how to irrigate barley, because, you know, that's basically why St. Joseph County is the most highly irrigated county in, you know, east of the Mississippi. And that's because they have sand that doesn't hold any water. So the one thing they needed to be able to put on was water. So
we play around with seeding rate. I'm still filling that one out a lot, but it's interesting. The seeding rate going up does tend to be beneficial, with the obvious trade-off being that you can develop a canopy. So then disease pressure can be possibly an issue, but I think that is probably the number one thing that we do differently. Is there's been times when we've had success with a very high seeding rate, and so the sand allows us to get away with that. It's been interesting. I'd say that when we get the rainfall early in the spring, really sets us up. And this year, I would say that was the number one thing that was different. We just didn't have as much rain. It's a shorter crop year, colder, dry spring. So interesting. But we'll see next year. I think we're going to go into it and definitely return with the Conlon that does well for us, and then we'll probably do a portion of our acres with Odyssey. See how we do with that one.
That's my advice, Alison. You shouldn't be eager for a new variety, right? You should know it works, and you're always having something that you try. And maybe someday then you make the switch, and then you have that, and then you try. Right. So it's, you know, it works. Say for you, Tom, you know, it works, and that's what you do. And you try something new, right? Yeah. You look at a little market development work, and then maybe you like it. You move over to that. Maybe you don't. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I agree.
It's nice to hear that assessment too, Aaron, of the ESBN. And I agree. It's been unique actually in its efficacy, I think, and ability to kind of highlight where we need to focus our attention moving forward. And so the idea of looking at our malting barley in the context of the MCIA trial, I think is nice potentially, because we can get a narrower set of varieties submitted into that, still get a look at them every year, and then have that direct connection back with the seed producers as well to say, okay, these are the ones that are really looking like they're coming to the top. Can we start to get some seed going in the state? And have that right in front of their face instead of having to kind of bring the ESBN results to the seed producers and to crop improvement. So that's encouraging. I appreciate that. It sounds like maybe we're on the right track.
Yeah.
Very good.
Am I muted? No, not muted. Okay. Allison, regarding seeding rates, do you know Caleb Michalke down at Sugar Creek?
Yes, I do.
Indiana? Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but he doubled the width of his planting rows in order to hit the amount of seeds per acre that he needs to hit. They actually are doing like this diamond
crosshatch. We've done the crosshatch on the hills before.
Yeah.
On a hillside.
So it's pretty interesting as far as like spacing versus seeds per acre without actually having like super intense density at the same time. It's pretty intriguing.
Yeah, it definitely is. And like I said, I need more years to get a real solid understanding of what we're seeing. But I would say that I'm much more comfortable than I was a few years ago. bumped up our seeding rates, and it really doesn't seem to be creating much issue for us. We get a boost in the yield from it. In fact, I would say it's almost as though the plants are sort of benefiting from being more densely populated. They tend to be a little taller. Interesting, very interesting to see that.
When I worked in wheat, we talked about some sort of double planting like that because we really struggled. Plant dates were always late on winter wheat up north, and then we would struggle to get the growth and tillering, so we wouldn't have the head count that we wanted come the following year. And so we thought about boosting population, but spreading it out by some sort of cross hatching. That would be really interesting to look at in winter. I wonder what you're achieving on the spring side. I mean, you know, we don't have those same challenges in the fall with establishment and tillering.
I would just say we have a pretty direct comparison because the grower that is essentially our neighbor, that they've been growing barley with us from year one, and they have stuck they're much more precise and regimented about not increasing the seeding rate. They're really worried about disease pressures, and their crop pretty consistently for the past 3 years was much shorter than ours, and the yields were just lower. And we did crosshatch method of seeding on one of the sloping ends of one of our fields just to try something new, but it really wasn't like the necessary factor. What the necessary factor was getting the seed in the ground, just even if it's in straight rows. And it just seemed to benefit the plants having a higher population. We got a taller, it's kind of like it helps build that moisture early in the season when it may need it more. And I think the sand is just very much an important component of it working, really, because you still have the drainage, but it sort of helps the plant gives them a boost.
I think competition with weeds too. I mean, that would be a benefit of, like you say, closing that canopy and just having more plants out there to compete with weeds as well. So
sometimes I forget where the origin of the data is, but I think it was MSU. If not, it was Aaron up in Canada. Oh no, maybe it wasn't that, but it was planting rate as it related to plumpness, and that's the significant impact from what I'm regurgitating your data. I think somebody help me here. That it was the certain. Well, there's Calvin's of course doing the planting rate research right now, and then Dennis Pennington also did the precision planting work to see if that had an impact on yields or disease as well. But it was plumpness that was the biggest thing that we found in that planting rate. Who on this call knows where that was?
That would correlate. That would definitely correlate. Plumpness would be like negatively correlated with fertilizer rates. So if you have more plants but the same fertilizer, lower fertilizer per plant, so lower protein, and then you bring in more moisture, it all kind of lines up as we would expect. But yeah, that's definitely.
I think it was actually less tillers too. Less tillers. So this was also planting date. So less tillers made bigger kernels, and it was again it was that the competition in the ground. It's got a little less flag leaf, a little less tiller, and so I saw it pretty heavily because you grew the Violetta. I saw that in the Violetta, which compared to say like a Calypso is a very uniform, with the Violetta is sort of arrowhead shaped.
Mm-hmm.
And so the plumpness would be, be more differences. But again, I just to see who had the data, who remembers where that was from.
There was a Western Canadian study that looked at the seed density rates, and as the seed density, the density of the stand went up, so as seeding rate increased, kernel size actually got smaller, right? But it was more uniform because of less tillering, right? Because you've got the stand like that, and actually the malting quality improved. And what was important about that was there was a lot of dogma there was a lot of dogma that was like, oh, you can't go too dense because then the kernels won't be as plump. But we kind of tried to overturn that. And I think to Alison's point, there seemed to be a lot of benefits to erring on the side of higher seeding rates, and sacrificing plumpness wasn't the problem, right? Getting a more uniform kernels size throughout the crop was actually quite beneficial. So the take-home message for me from the Western Canadian study was err on the side of more. If we're on the side of less dense stands, we should be erring on the side of more dense.
Very cool. Yeah.
Awesome. In terms of malt quality, right? Yeah. Cool. Well, I think this is our longest session to date and quite lively. So we're about to hit the 2-hour mark. So any closing remarks?
This is really kind of what I think one of the things we envisioned, we wanted to come out of this, to turn it into a true happy hour where, we have something specific, but I think these types of discussions are just, the kind where you look at the clock and go, oh, wow. Look at all the time that went by. So I think this is the type of thing we'd like to promote more of. And I think we all learn a lot from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, same time, same day after Christmas time, I guess. Cool. Thank you everyone for being on the call. It's been a lot of fun. All 8 sessions have been a lot of fun, but especially this one. I might edit that out of the YouTube. But anyway, cheers everybody. Have a great week next week. Have a great holiday. Stay safe, stay sane. I'll try as well. Cheers everyone. Good to see you.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All right.